Electromagnetic waves in periodic structures. Everything we've been talking about is going to come together in this lecture. And the first thing we'll talk about is block waves. That's waves inside of these periodic structures. And we'll talk about electromagnetic bands and go on to isofrequency contours, which is more how we analyze the electromagnetic properties of periodic structures. Block waves. So if we imagine a wave passing through a dielectric object, clearly the wave will travel slower inside the dielectric object, allowing the wavefront to advance past the wavefront behind on the shadow side of that dielectric object. And so notice the field here gets perturbed by that dielectric object. Here we're going to do the same thing, but now we have a periodic array of these objects. Well, if we look at the field got perturbed in the same way on the previous slide, but it gets perturbed behind each one of these. And the sort of magical thing that has happened here is that the field has taken on the same periodicity as the structure that it is passing through. And I think this little animation here makes that kind of obvious why that is. Now, that does not mean the field will look like the dielectric structure it's passing through. If those were, instead of circles, they were smiley faces, the electromagnetic field would not look like smiley faces. It would just have the same symmetry and period as those smiley faces. Now, it turns out there's a little bit more to this story, and this is the Bloch theorem. And it turns out that the field inside a periodic structure isn't exactly the same symmetry and period as the field that it's in. Instead, we write the overall electric field as the product of two different terms. This first term is the expression for a uniform plane wave. So we could draw our periodic structure with this nice uniform plane wave and its wave vector beta, which we'll actually be calling the Bloch wave vector now, because the combination of all this stuff, the overall electric field, is our Bloch wave. But this term over here is this plane wave term. This does not have the same symmetry or period as the periodic structure. It's its own thing. And so it's really not correct to say the overall field has the same periodicity and symmetry as the structure that it's in. This other term is the envelope term. And this modulates our plane wave and essentially gives it a bumpy amplitude. This amplitude envelope, this does take on exactly the same period and the same symmetry as the periodic structure the wave is propagating through. So whatever it's propagating through, it'll have lattice vectors. And if we want to describe the periodicity of this envelope term, it has those same lattice vectors. Well, the overall field is the product of those things. So if we multiply them together, we get these things that kind of look like waves, but they're bumpy. So I like to call them bumpy plane waves, but the technical term for these are Bloch waves. So if you want to sound intelligent, call them a Bloch wave. I like to call them bumpy plane waves. But, we can clearly see some wave fronts happening here. It's just that the amplitude is also being modulated. So that's what waves look like inside of periodic structures. Here's an actual simulation of a periodic structure, and there's a plane wave illuminating it. And when it goes into this lattice, we still see its plane wave-like, a little bit more compressed than it was out here, and that makes sense. There's a refractive index happening here. But it's not a uniform plane wave. There's a bunch of bumps. And when it goes through, then when it leaves the lattice, it's a uniform plane wave again. Same simulation, but now I'm coming in at an angle. And we can see that this Bloch wave inside here even refracts. If we look at these wave fronts, it's at a different angle than the applied wave. So these Bloch waves really are acting kind of like plane waves. And in fact, they really are the fundamental states of waves inside this periodic structure, just like plane waves are the fundamental states in a homogeneous medium. Let's get a little bit deeper into the math. So here we have the permittivity, and if this is periodic, I should be able to add or subtract any lattice vector and get to the same point again. If it's truly periodic with direct lattice vectors T1, T2, and T3. So that means that the amplitude term will have to be periodic in the same way. I should be able to add any translation vector to a position and really arrive at a picture that looks the same as our original position. So the amplitude term really does have the same period and symmetry as the structure that it is in. Now, for things like diffraction gratings, this is really only periodic in one direction. This case is periodic in X. It's not periodic in the Y direction, or it's not periodic in the Z direction. So we would write the equations we just wrote, but maybe a little bit differently. We don't even really need to use the translation vectors here. We can just write an integer multiple of the period. And it's the same for the permittivity and that amplitude term. And since Y and Z aren't doing anything interesting here, very often we would just write our permittivity and amplitude term just this way to imply that it's periodic in the X direction. Electromagnetic bands. So let's wrap a black box around Maxwell's equations and pretend we have something that can solve this wave equation. And we're going to ask it a question. We're going to tell it what our lattice looks like. So we'll describe the permeability and permittivity. And we're going to ask a question. We'll say, what on earth through this lattice goes in the direction of the block wave vector and has a wavelength that the block wave vector describes? So our question is, what on earth goes this way with this period? So we ask that question of our magical electromagnetic solver, and out comes our answers. And it turns out there's an infinite number of these answers, because we can always go to higher and higher frequency and get more and more answers. Now, if we're solving this on a computer, we only have so much resolution, so we'll only be able to resolve so many of those eigenmodes. But physically, there's always an infinite number. So our solutions come out, our eigenmodes come in with eigenvalue-eigenvector pairs. So for every eigenvalue, we have an eigenvector. And notice how we've written our wave equation in the form of an eigenvalue problem. Our eigenvalue is k0 squared. So that's actually our eigenvalues, which will tell us the frequency of the waves. And then our eigenvectors are telling us the magnetic field. That's the picture of the modes. So the eigenvectors are the pictures, and the eigenvalues are the frequencies of the modes. Physically, there's an infinite number, but when we're solving this on a computer, there's only a finite number, a few dozen, a few hundred that we can resolve at any time. Okay, so now we're going to go back to this idea of our irreducible Brillouin zone. And what we'll do, we've labeled our vertices, and these vertices are called key points of symmetry, and there's a convention to how that these are named. And to understand everything about this lattice, we would have to somehow raster through this entire volume of the irreducible Brillouin zone and calculate all of the eigenmodes, so that's eigenvalues and eigenvectors for every point in that volume. That's a lot of calculations. Instead, what's done to make a band diagram is that we just pick a single line path around the perimeter of the irreducible Brillouin zone. So maybe we'll choose to start at the U point. We'll walk down to X. We'll walk back to gamma, up to L, down to K, and back to W. And so we pick this line path. So even though we're sort of meandering throughout 3 dimensions, it's a single line path. And I can grab these two endpoints and I can stretch them out. And that becomes the horizontal axis on the photonic band diagram. It's marching through around the perimeter of the irreducible Brillouin zone. So as we're progressing horizontally, we're changing both direction and period of the wave. So we'll pick a whole bunch of points. Maybe we pick 200 points. And for every one of the block wave vectors, we call our magical electromagnetic solver, and out comes a bunch of eigenvalues and eigenvectors. Well, if I plot those eigenvalues vertically, I get a bunch of points. Then I move to my next block wave vector, plot all the eigenvalues. Move to the next block wave vector, plot all the eigenvalues. And as long as my steps horizontally are fine enough, all of these points line up to form these lines. These are the bands. These are the allowed states. So if I see a blue line, that means there definitely is a wave going this direction, and here is its frequency. And we can determine a lot from band diagrams. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So here's the best animation I could conjure up to really describe what's happening as we're constructing a band diagram. So notice this blue vector here. That's our block wave vector as we're marching around the perimeter of the Brillouin zone. So the vector is always going from the center point that we label gamma out to wherever we are marching along the perimeter of this irreducible Brillouin zone. So each of those block wave vectors, it's changing direction and magnitude. And so this little sheet over here is drawn to scale to our lattice, and it's really showing you the period of the block wave that we're asking about and the direction as we're marching around the perimeter of this irreducible Brillouin zone. So for every one of the block wave vectors, we are plotting the eigenvalues, and they're lining up to form bands. So this is an actual real simulation. Those really are the bands of this face-centered cubic photonic crystal. Now this vertical axis, we're plotting the eigenvalues, but it's not k0 squared. And it turns out we will just do some math to that to normalize it. So we'll call that the normalized frequency, and we end up with A over lambda. And we'll talk more about this in other lectures, but that's a very convenient way to normalize so that we can scale our lattice to work at whatever wavelength that we want it to operate. Here we're constructing the photonic band diagram of a two-dimensional lattice. So I'm showing 3 by 3 unit cells. I'm showing down here its Brillouin zone, and it looks like I used a capital G instead of gamma. Sorry for that. But this red arrow is showing the block wave vector as we're marching around the perimeter of this irreducible Brillouin zone. So for each one of those block wave vectors, I am plotting the eigenvalues, and of course they're lining up to form these bands. Now something else I'm doing, you'll notice the 1 and the 2 written here. So as I'm calculating this right here, I am calculating what the block mode looks like in a 3 by 3 section of the lattice. And of course I'm doing it for the first band and the second band. This is the block mode for the second band, and this is the block mode for the first band. And if I watch this, I'll notice the wave here becomes more compressed as my block wave becomes bigger. Sorry, as my block wave vector becomes bigger. That's because the magnitude of our block wave vector is 2 pi over the wavelength. We'll also notice if we look at these block modes, and we try to identify the wave fronts, a little bit hard because it's a bumpy plane wave, it's a block wave. But if we look at the angle of those phase fronts, we'll see that that's always perpendicular to the block wave vector. Our block wave vector is left-right right now, so our wave fronts are up-down because the block wave vector is this way. That's the direction the wave is actually traveling. Now the block wave vector is going upward, and we can see those wave fronts tilting to the left, always staying perpendicular to the block wave vector. Now the higher order modes, they get crazier and bumpier and become very pretty, and sometimes it's sort of hard to tell which way that the wave fronts are pointing. And the higher order the mode, the crazier they look and the harder that becomes. But the lower order bands is rather easy to do that with. And they tend to be the ones that we use practically anyway. So this is a neat animation. It's available on the course website, and I definitely recommend watching this until you understand everything that's happening here. Now, why do we calculate band diagrams? We're taking this shortcut around the perimeter to minimize the number of computations, so we have something that's very fast to calculate. Doing it otherwise would be a lot slower, but even still, we can recognize band gaps. Those are spans of frequency where there are no bands. And it turns out our lattice would act like a mirror in a band gap. We can estimate transmission and reflection spectrum. I'll show you that on the next slide. From the bands, we can determine the phase velocity of the wave, the group velocity, and we can do all kinds of cool things with the dispersion. And I'll show you some of them in this lecture. So on left, oh, this is crazy, but we have these blue lines. These are the bands. And on the right, I'm showing transmission through the lattice. And so we have a wave that's going through the lattice vertically. And what we can see, so the vertical direction is gamma to y. So really, we're looking at this section of the band diagram to estimate what transmission would look like for waves incident from the top and traveling vertically. Well, what we can see from the wide to gamma span is that there's this gap here. We can't call it a band gap because it has to go all the way across. These gray lines are actually showing us our band gaps. But since we don't have waves traveling in any of these other directions, only gamma to y, this is the gap we're interested in, and we notice that translates over to the transmission spectra. And here's another one up here, and another one up here. So by looking at the bands, I don't even have to simulate the lattice. I can look at them and make a pretty good guess what the transmission and reflection would look like. Also looking at curvature of the bands, I'm getting things like phase velocity and group velocity and other cool stuff. So photonic band diagrams apply only to infinitely periodic lattices, and we never have infinitely periodic lattices. Our lattices sometimes only have maybe a dozen unit cells, but still the behavior here represents what's in the band diagram usually pretty closely. So it's a great place to start our analysis. Very fast to calculate these things. But the band diagram is missing information. That's because we did not iterate through the entire irreducible Brillouin zone. So in this case, I'm drawing bands for the direct lattice, and it has a dielectric medium of 3 with a bunch of air holes cut out. And the reciprocal lattice is drawn this way. Based on the symmetry of the direct lattice, we've whittled this down to a little triangular region for our irreducible Brillouin zone. And it's said that the band extremes almost always occur at the key points of symmetry. And there's times that they don't. And I should probably put an example in here of when they don't. I don't have that. But almost always they occur at the key points of symmetry. So marching around the perimeter, we're going to capture most of the band extremes for catching band gaps. But it's missing information. And this information is often very important. One example is if we want to engineer the dispersion of these periodic structures. In other words, we're looking at the properties of waves traveling in different directions and trying to do some weird things there. We can't do that from the band diagram. We need more information, and we actually have to iterate and solve our eigenvalue problem at every point throughout the Brillouin zone. So here's what it looks like when we do that. So we will iterate back and forth. We'll raster through this, and we have a whole bunch of values of beta. And so we're plotting our eigenvalues now vertically. So over here, this bottom square, this is our Brillouin zone. This triangle here is showing us the irreducible Brillouin zone. And for every beta, we plot the eigenvalues. And when we do that with closely enough spaced betas, we get these sheets. These are the full bands of a two-dimensional lattice. This is telling us all the information that we need, but clearly there's a lot more calculations happening here than for just this standard band diagram where all we did was march around the perimeter of the irreducible Brillouin zone. So here's an animation of this calculation process. And notice the block wave vector. I've set up a double loop over x and y, and we're iterating through a whole bunch of block wave vectors and vertically plotting the eigenvalues we're getting that I'm plotting as little spheres. And when our betas are close enough, these eigenvalues are forming sheets. But pretty much everything we've been talking about, what the block waves look like, it follows what we've been talking about. But here, we're just getting more information. So I was challenged to show the relation between the full bands that we're looking at here and the band diagram. And here's what I came up with. So we start with the full bands, and we look at our irreducible Brillouin zone that we identified when we were doing our band diagram. So the next thing I want to do, I want to erect walls around the perimeter of this irreducible Brillouin zone. And it's going to slice right through these full bands. So that's what we've done. Now what I want to do is I want to find where these bands intersect these walls that I've just erected. So that's what we're looking at here, just the intersection. Now what I want to do, I want to grab the end of this wall and I want to fold this out and stretch it out. And when I do that, now I am looking at a photonic band diagram. So the photonic band diagram we talked about, which is much quicker to calculate, is hidden inside the full band diagram, where we have these sheets instead of just lines. Isofrequency contours. So let's talk about phase and power very briefly. This is a deep story, but we'll simplify this. So inside an isotropic material, we can plot something that we call an index ellipsoid, and it's a map of refractive index as a function of direction. So in the vacuum of space, for example, no matter what direction a wave is going, it sees the same refractive index, and so we would get a circle here. The next thing we'll do is we'll pick a point on this surface. And it turns out the wave vector describing that wave is the vector we calculate when we connect the origin to the point on the surface. So this is the direction that phase travels. That's the ripples of the wave will go in the direction of k. Now it turns out power, and the direction power goes, is defined differently. Power goes in a direction perpendicular to the tangent of this surface at the point we selected. Now, since this is a circle, our power, our pointing vector, is in the same direction of k. So the ripples in our wave is also the direction that power is moving. And this is the simplest case, and this is also the case we're always programmed to think about. And so when anything else happens, it appears magical. But in fact, this is probably more a special case. Now, in anisotropic materials, this is no longer a circle. They can be ellipsoids. And these are very often called ellipsoids. Now the refractive index a wave would see actually changes with direction. But let's go ahead and do what we just did on the, let's pick a point on the surface. And our wave vector, the direction of the ripples, is in a direction of a vector extending from the origin to that point on the surface. But what about power? Power now is going in a different direction. We construct this tangent. Power goes perpendicular to that. So power is going in a direction different than the ripples of our wave. So here's an analogy to help you understand this. So imagine you're standing still, and now you spin around in a circle 20 times really fast. So you're super dizzy. And then you try to run towards something. So your body is facing that something. You want to go that way, but since you're dizzy, you're actually running off to the side. And that's what's happening here. The ripples is kind of the direction the wave wants to go, but because of the anisotropy or other craziness we're talking about, the wave actually goes in a different direction. So waves inside anisotropic materials or periodic structures, they're sort of dizzy that way. And phase and power can be in different directions, and I have a picture of that later. Let's go back to these bands we calculated, the full bands, and let's look at the first one. If we were to slice this, so we pick a frequency and slice it, and we look at the cross sections, we're drawing the cross sections down here of different frequencies. And so these are sort of index ellipsoids, but for a periodic structure, and we're seeing circles here. It gets more interesting when we look at other bands. Let's grab the second band. And here I'm slicing it at 3 different frequencies. So I've drawn a plane of these frequencies, and there's a cross section here. So the blue plane, the cross section is the blue line. We have our gold colored plane, and it crosses our band. And so here's what that cross section looks like. And then of course the red plane, and here's the red line. So our index ellipsoids, or isofrequency contours, these are called, can be very crazy shapes inside periodic structures, and we can get some really crazy behavior out of periodic structures, and it's all engineered through these isofrequency contours. So rather than look at it that way, which is intuitively tells us what's going on, we will just look at the isofrequency contours, and that's all you'll ever see, and you kind of have to understand, oh, okay, that really comes from slices through those bands. And we look at the shape of these, and we play around with different shape unit cells, and we engineer these bands, and that's dispersion engineering of photonic crystals. And so very often you'll see this and hopefully a picture of the lattice that these came from next to it. And this is usually just of one specific band. And multiple bands may be of interest, and you're never really sure which band is the one that's interesting. So very often we'll plot several bands and see where we get interesting behavior. So here's one neat thing. Let's look at these contours, and let's look at where this contour is flat. Well, a wave traveling left or right, the ripples will be traveling this way, and the power travels in that same direction. But what if a wave tries to go at an angle? Well, the power is still forced to go straight. So over this whole span of angles that a wave may try to propagate, it's forced to propagate straight. And this phenomenon is called self-collimation. No matter what direction this wave tries to go, it is forced to go straight and follow the lattice. Now there's a limit to that. Clearly a wave traveling in this direction, or trying to travel, the ripples in this direction, will actually self-collimate vertically. So there is a limit here. But for the most part, here we see a diverging beam hit the lattice, and all of a sudden it does not diverge anymore. And it propagates through this lattice, in principle, indefinitely. So that's one neat thing that periodic structures can do. Here's another. We can actually get negative refraction. So this top picture is the ordinary case. We're going in a medium that has a low refractive index, so we're just drawing half of that index ellipsoid, into a medium that has a higher refractive index. And so since this is a periodic structure, let's not use Snell's law. Let's do something more general called phase matching. So we have an incoming wave vector, and we look at the tangential component. The tangential component of the wave vector has to be continuous across the interface. So for convenience, we'll copy it over here. And then what we do is we drop a projection down until it crosses the index ellipsoid. And now we have the wave vector in the second medium. And of course, this bending is called refraction. And the index ellipsoid is a circle, so power and phase are in the same direction. And that's what we see. We see an incoming wave, it gets refracted, and power and phase is all aligned. But now let's go into this magical periodic structure that has a very crazy index ellipsoid on the other side. It's not really correct to call it an index ellipsoid. That's the analogy we're making. It's an isofrequency contour. But let's do the same thing. So we have this incoming wave, and the tangential component of that has to be continuous across the interface. For convenience, we'll copy it over here. We drop a projection down, and it hits the surface at this point. So our phase refracts rather ordinarily. However, power is going to go in sort of this backward direction. That's not the direction we would expect things to go. Now let's look at the wave. The ripples are clearly trying to send the wave this way, but the actual power, the actual beam, is traveling this way. And if this were light, our eyes don't see the phase. Our eyes don't see the ripple. We would just see a beam going in apparently the wrong direction, and that's called negative refraction. And we don't need a metamaterial with a negative refractive index to get negative refraction. We can get that out of a periodic structure just from engineering the dispersion. So this is just a small taste of the crazy, wonderful things that we can do through these isofrequency contours. So self-collimation, negative refraction, superprisms, and other really cool things.